Tuesday, November 5, Acceptance and Rejection. Lesson 2 described the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6, but did not cover the final section of that story, which is studied here. Read John chapter 6, verses 51 to 71. What did Jesus say that people had trouble accepting? John chapter 6, beginning at verse 51. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Then the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Jesus said to them, Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. He said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, Does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are full of the Spirit and life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. From this time many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. You do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Then Jesus replied, Have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil. He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. Having just been fed miraculously by Jesus, the people were ready to crown him king, and we read that in John chapter 1, verses 1 to 15. Some time after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him, because they saw the signs that he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? Jesus said, Have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. But in talking with them later at the Capernaum synagogue, he explained the spiritual meaning of the miracle, saying, "I am the bread of life," in verse 35. He expounds in more detail that this bread is his flesh, which he gives for the life of the world, in verse 51. "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." This saying opened the eyes of the multitude to the fact that Jesus would not be their earthly king. He did not fit the mould produced by earthly thinking. They refused conversion, which would transform the way they thought, so that they could recognize and accept Jesus as the Messiah. Many of his disciples left him at this point, as we read in verse 66. From that time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. From a human sense, this must have been hard for Jesus. The approbation of the crowd is pleasing. Who doesn't want to be liked? But seeing many people draw back and question one's principles is naturally discouraging as well. Seeing the multitude depart, Jesus asked his inner circle, the 12, if they want to leave too. This is when Peter makes his amazing confession, another witness as to both what Jesus has and who he is. In verses 68 and 69 we read, "You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." The disciples had been with Jesus for a couple of years, travelling with him, seeing his miracles, hearing his sermons. They knew from experience that there was no one comparable to him. The conviction settled upon them that, however unusual some situations might be, this man was the Messiah, regardless of how much they still didn't understand about his purpose for coming. Only after his death and resurrection did they start to understand why Jesus came. And so to finish today, what can we learn from this story about the fact that the majority is usually wrong? Why must we remember this, especially with the aspects of our faith that are unpopular with the majority, even the majority of Christians? This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.